Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Krakow. Unfortunately, we were unable to invite you to the Krakow branch of the Institute of National Remembrance, as the conference room is located in the building that is still under construction. The room we are currently using would not be able to accommodate all of us. Although we are delighted that the Need to Know conference has come to Poland, and we are particularly pleased to be organizing it in the royal capital city of Krakow. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Karol Polejowski, the Deputy President of the Institute of National Remembrance. I would like to welcome Dr. Kamil Nedvedicki, Deputy Director of the Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regime, Professor Thomas Wegener-Fries, Director of the Cold War Studies Center, and all the distinguished members of the organizing committee. I'm pleased to see such a distinguished group of researchers, historians, political scientists, and the representatives of security studies. All of you are united by the desire of truth and the fascination with the activities of intelligence services. I hope that this conference will meet your expectations and allow you to further your research.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Professor Fries, Kamil, Professor Filip Musiał, thank you for hosting us here today in Krakow. All distinguished guests, it is a great pleasure for me, both personally and on behalf of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, which I have had the honor of heading since the beginning of this year. Yes, I am an acting president of the Institute of National Remembrance after the election, former President Karol Nawrocki as a President of Republic of Poland. It's great pleasure to open our joint Need to Know international conference dedicated to the history of intelligence and counterintelligence in Europe and around the world. We are meeting in the royal city of Krakow, the former seat of the kings of Poland, on Wolnica Square, a name that, in Polish, evokes the idea of freedom. It is also the center of the former Kazimierz district, Krakow's historic Jewish quarter, whose inhabitants were systematically murdered as a result of the criminal policy of Nazi Germany. Even though we are not going to be discussing late medieval Krakow, which is a subject of particular importance to me personally, because, as you perfectly know, my first field of interest is medieval history. Because of my earlier research, nor Krakow in the tragic times of the German occupation, it would be inappropriate to overlook these chapters of history as we stand here today. Remembrance is key, as both the motto and the name of the Institute imply, and this mission lies at the heart of everything we do. Let me briefly recall, since I already spoke about it last year in Warsaw, at the opening of our previous meeting, that the very idea of this conference stems directly from our, in large part, tragic Central European experience of the 20th century. In short, it was an era of criminal totalitarian regimes, Nazism and communism, but also of the omnipresent and all-knowing so-called security apparatuses, special services, including intelligence services. This applies both to those serving the German Reich and the Soviet Union. In this context, not only from a Polish perspective, it was crucial to bring materials related to such services, preserved in our archives at the Institute of National Remembrance, as well as in the collections of our partner institutions in countries such as Germany, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria into global academic circulation. In Poland, the obligation to disseminate this knowledge arises directly from the provisions of the Act of the Institute of National Remembrance, adopted in 1998 by the Polish Parliament. The scope of this conference is significant not only from a purely academic perspective. This is why I am particularly pleased that we are hosting Dr. Katarina Steinberg from Leistikow-Strasse Memorial in Potsdam, the KGB prison at Leistikow-Strasse 1 in German city of Potsdam, run by the Soviet counterintelligence organization known as SMERSH, just like Warsaw's 37 Rakowiecka Street, today the Museum of Cursed Soldiers and Political Prisoners of the Polish People's Republic, or Krakow's Montelupich Street, is another address marked by suffering. These places remind us that our task is not only to research and document crimes, but also to preserve the memory of the victims and to educate society, including through museums. Here, once again, I'm speaking from experience. The theme of this year's Need to Know conference is disinformation, deception, and intelligence inspiration. In other words, lies and manipulation in intelligence and counterintelligence activities, understood in various ways. This also resonates with the warning expressed by the renowned Polish historian Professor Szujski, who argued that false and manipulated history, what we might today call a narrative, is the teacher of false politics. The role of institutions of remembrance is, among others, the ability to react to also these types of challenges. Władysław Bułhak and Dr. Michał Klima will speak precisely about this matter from complementary Polish and Czech perspectives later on. Looking around this room, I can see how truly international our conference has become, gathering a community of researchers and increasing number of female scholars who are passionate about intelligence and represent practically every continent. I warmly welcome all of you here in Poland, in Kraków, one of Europe's historic capital cities, the place where the first Polish university, the Jagiellonian University, was founded and continues to operate to this day. Though I must honestly admit it was established shortly after our Czech friends and neighbors founded their university in Prague. If I'm right, yes? It was almost 20 years earlier. In this context, I would first and foremost like to thank our colleagues from the Czech Republic, from our sister/brother institution, the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, headed by Director Ladisław Kudrna. You have not only brought together an outstanding group of speakers, but also played an active part in shaping the conference programme. I'm also very pleased to once again see here our long-standing friends and partners in the Need to Know project and beyond. Professor Thomas Friis of the Center for Cold War Studies of the University of Southern Denmark. Professor Michael Goodman of King's College London. Dr. Dieter Bacher of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Research on the Consequences of War in Graz, Austria, and Dr. Ivo Jurve of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. Last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues from the Institute of National Remembrance headquarters in Warsaw, as well as the Institute branch in Kraków. Many people have contributed to this project, and I cannot mention them all, but I would like to extend a special thank to you, Director Filip Musiał. Members of the conference organizing committee, Dr. Przemysław Gasztold and Władysław Bułhak, and above all, Dr. Elżbieta Pietrzyk-Dąbrowska. It is thanks in large part to her exceptional organizational skills that everything is perfectly in place today, from the knowledge-packed papers to the hot aromatic awaiting us, coffee of course, awaiting us all as a reward, of course, after the first session. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you productive and inspiring lectures and discussion. Thank you for your coming to Krakow. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much that I can join this opening session on behalf of the University of Southern Denmark, but of course also of our other partners in crime in the organizational committee from King's College. I'm looking for Mike. Oh, there he is. And from the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for the Remembrance of War, and certainly, of course, to our esteemed Czech colleagues. We've been on this journey together now since 2011. It doesn't sound like much, but it's almost 15 years that we have been going on. And what we thought was only going to be a one-time shot turned out actually to be one of the leading European platforms of this field. And it's as you also said, it's an area which is regrettably relevant to us today, because we have here the chance to turn the tragic history of the Central European countries into knowledge, into lessons learned that we can use in our current challenging security situation. And I think especially when we're talking about disinformation, here we have a quite unique chance. This is we all know it. This is a field of intelligence and counterintelligence, maybe in particular, where we can go awfully wrong and in the end spend state resources without end. And state resources are normally not endless. So we have to be prudent, we have to be clever, and I think that our joint history can actually at least give us a little bit of hint where we can solve security problems with intelligence means and where we can challenge political problems with politicals. Before we can really start, I also need to hand out a lot of thanks to our co-organizers, and of course especially to our friends at the Institute of National Remembrance. Thank you to you, Professor Acting President Karl Poliowski, not only for this conference, but I would say for the whole cooperation that we have had throughout the years with the IPN, and of course to Felix Musial, and also to Michael Wenkler, which many of us met yesterday at the offices, and of course to Elżbieta, who everybody has been communicating with. You have been a big help throughout the year, not just these days. I hope that you will get some rest on Saturday. And of course, Vadik and Przemek have been imperative in getting the organizing committee working together, and I really do hope that we may continue this journey on the 15th year next year, and maybe we can jointly go to the Danish-German borderlands, to the wonderful city of Sønderborg. It's not a medieval capital, but at least it was a medieval president. We had one of our medieval kings there. After he was a king, but still, and of course, it's a city with a special connection to Polish-Danish relations, which everybody knows from the Polish national anthem, where this exact place where our university is now is Stefan Czernyski swam across the waters. So without further ado, I hope that we can continue this journey. Thank you very much to all of you, and let's have some great discussions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here again. Thank you for IPM for organizing it, yet another great conference. And we're going to talk about a very optimistic subject this morning, nuclear winter, our favorite, which is very great because it combines, the disinformation with KGB and all the scares that we're seeing in the world lately. I want to talk about it in terms of how it was achieved and to hopefully tie to what we see today. Understanding of this operation, I hope, will give us a better view of examining what is going on in the world today. And to do that, we're going to be talking about reflexive control framework. And the reflexive control, the idea was probably spelled out long time ago, but officially defined by a Soviet mathematician who defined it as transferring the basis for decision making from your adversary to yourself. So the point is not to change their opinion, but to change the framework on which they base their opinion. And in case of nuclear winter, it achieved it through epistemic colonization of the knowledge. And it was embedded in the structures of knowledge. Instead of attacking them, it became part of it. The achievement is all the greater for the fact that it did not fight the expertise, but it used it to promote the message that was convenient. And it's being used today, the same playbook is being used today by the Russian intelligence. And today, for example, they're using generative AI for the same purpose, which is very convenient, very cheap, and much faster. So we're going to be talking about what happened in 1982, the perfect moment. There were a lot of demonstrations against hosting American nuclear weapons on NATO territory. And demonstrations in all Europe. And in June 1982, two scientists, Crutzen and Burke, published a paper in a scientific publication on the atmospheric effects of nuclear war. They called it Twilight at Noon, saying that, from all the explosion, it will be dark. The paper caught attention of the Kremlin, and Andropov, who was the head of KGB, ordered the Soviet Academy to produce supporting research to incite more demonstrations in the West. So the point is the KGB did not invent the science. Somebody published something, and they jumped on the wagon. The sequence was such. So in June, the paper was published. This is the origin point. In 82, Soviet scientists who were shown this journal pivot to nuclear war research. So the people on the Soviet side did not engage in nuclear research at all. They engaged in Mars dust storms, things like that. And in 83, several scientists decided to publish a big paper on it. Carl Sagan was co-opted for this research, even though he was not originally engaged in this particular topic, but he had a great reputation and he was very widely known. And once the paper was accepted to science, they made a conference which drew the participation from the Soviet side and told everybody nuclear winter is coming. So from Western research to Soviet amplification to institutional validation, it took less than 18 months. How do we know it was a KGB operation? Sergei Tretyakov, who was a high-ranking KGB officer and SVR officer, researcher at the Red Banner Institute, defected in 2000. According to him, it was known to the Soviet scientists that the theory was ridiculous, no legitimate facts to support it, but it was exactly what Andropov needed to cause terror in the West. And the KGB was especially proud for this operation. the illusion of independent confirmation. So the point was that it was the research produced in the US and independently confirmed in the Soviet Union. But you cannot compare even the hardware that it was operating on, because the US was using Cray computer. The Soviet Union, the biggest machine was Besson. The gap was 700 to 1 in terms of hardware abilities. And it was not effective for modeling. And the scientist, Vladimir Alexander, who produced the research, was told to produce the research. At the time, it was already understood to be weak and using obsolete model. The CIA that examined his research said it's purely derivative. There was no independent confirmation. And remember that for a Soviet scientist to be able to participate in this research, to get machine time, to travel to the West, to participate in it, everything required KGB approval. So it's not like, he came up one morning and said, let me do that. It was all directed. So the presentation of two independent research teams, that was exactly the point of reflexive control. By the way, the guy who produced this research disappeared in Madrid in 1985, never to be found again. Even the KGB didn't find him. So the fact that the research was questionable was already known in 1985. But it did not change the narrative, because the narrative was too good to abandon. It was never a consensus. It was always a scientific controversy. But the people who presented an opposite point of view were never getting the publication or the fame that Carl Sagan had. It turned out that they used incomplete data. Not only that, they took the worst possible scenario and they amplified the worst possible scenario and everything. But it still didn't matter, because that's how it works. It was embedded so well that all the bigger scientific publications, the Science Journal, the Ambio, and even the Nobel Peace Prize was granted to those people who participated in the research. It framed the whole debate. Now the deterrence became a dirty word. Like, if you're for deterrence, it means you're for nuclear winter, and you're already playing not in your home field. And if we look at the person who did the most for pushing this narrative out, is Carl Sagan. I'm not claiming he was a spy. I'm not even claiming that he got, co-opted willingly. But he already was very famous in the West for his other publications. And he worked with Soviet scientists since the 70s. He provided the legitimacy platform, and he didn't need to be recruited, because he was already a willing cooperator. His third wife was Marxist, so I don't know how much that impacts his view, but and this is the ideal operation from Soviet intelligence standpoint. You don't need to pay somebody. You already have somebody who is willing to work with you, and you exploit their existing networks and existing trust and ideological sympathy. So reflexive control was achieved, not only achieved, but also sustained, because it was even 2017 Smithsonian Magazine displayed when Carl Sagan whirled the world. He was like the father of the warning. Gorbachev cited Carl Sagan as somebody who affected him when he was talking to Ronald Reagan. In 2023, Japan Defense Institute, they came up with 18-page review, not citing any of the potential connections to the KGB. Like, everybody completely forgot this part. So basically, reflexive control is achieved. And we have the same playbook today, but it's working so much faster. During the Cold War, it took 18 months or even longer to get embedded. With the generative AI, if you're doing the poisoning, you do it today, tomorrow somebody is asking ChatGPT something, they get the response immediately. What it teaches us is that you can do fake news, you can do disinformation, but the most effective way is to embed it in the machine that produces your knowledge, whether it was scientific publications during the Cold War or the generative AI of today. And the scientific authority becomes the battleground itself. And we can, refer to the Russian stories of American biolabs in Ukraine. This is like everybody's talking about it. The fact that, it's not true doesn't matter. We're not prepared for this. Like, we don't have any mechanism that will stop it from happening. So what we need to do is we need to protect the epistemic infrastructure. When we provide knowledge and give access to the public, we need to provide ways to flag research or to flag information that is not reliable. Just debunking it, coming up and saying, no, there are no American biolabs in Ukraine who are doing combat mosquitoes is not enough, because nobody's going to listen to you. We need to protect the integrity rather than combat the facts. Nuclear winter succeeded by colonizing scientific authority. Russian intelligence is using exactly the same thing today. And the question is, who controls the frameworks? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, some of you probably already know, I've written extensively on the KGB's AIDS disinformation campaign, the role of the Stasi in it. The Stasi called it Operation Denver, where they tried to convince the world that basically the AIDS virus was developed as a US biological weapon at Fort Detrick, Maryland. But one thing I sort of stumbled upon is there's sort of a Cuban angle to all of this, that the Cuban state security and also Cuban propaganda structure was also very much involved in this, and in some ways they laid the foundation for what became this AIDS disinformation campaign. And in fact, I think the Stasi was somewhat, the HVA was somewhat startled because in 1985, the head of Cuban's Directorate General for Intelligence, or their intelligence service, or DGI, German Luis Barrero Caramis, when he was in Berlin in 1987, he basically told the Stasi, you know what you're saying about, about this AIDS virus being developed at Fort Detrick, we have actual proof. We'll give you actual proof. We have it. We'll send it to you. And interestingly, I don't know if they ever sent the information to the HVA, but another unit of Cuban state security responsible for securing the Cuban economy at the Ministry of Interior, the MININT is what the abbreviation is, had already presented the Stasi with this proof in 1986. And what was this proof? Well, it was basically what was already publicly known about US biological weapons research, what was already publicly known about CIA covert operations against Cuba, things like Operation Mongoose, where they tried to assassinate Castro. And basically all of these materials, including some reports by US journalists based on anonymous sources, all of it had been cited by Fidel Castro in a speech in July 1981, which is very interesting. And in fact, he had actually read from some of these documents, some of these articles when he gave his speech. So the fact that they accepted this as proof is very interesting. But on top of that, what's also interesting is that the Stasi, especially the Minister for State Security, Erich Mielke, had long dismissed these, basically this propaganda from the Cubans of US biological weapons attacks against Cuba. And he's basically said, you're always talking about this. You're always saying that, there's this biological sabotage or biological weapons sabotage by the US. Sometimes we have problems here, with grain harvest or something, and there's some problem with some pest. But the thing is, we're always looking for foreign agents and we never find any. You need to find them. You need to present them as proof. Perhaps this criticism was somewhat unfair because, of course, we know that in the early 1960s, they made similar accusations about, the West German government developing biological weapons, and their scientists were basically burnt spies that were brought back to East Germany. Then they had this big press conference saying, I saw them developing the biological weapons, blah, blah, blah. But these are the kind of witnesses that the Cubans needed, but they never did it. They didn't do it properly, and I think that was the main critic that Milch was trying to get by. So although this accusation failed to impress the East Germans, they served as a vital background not only for the KGB's HIV as U.S. bioweapon thesis, but also for similar conspiracy theories in the U.S. that helped feed this KGB disinformation. For example, there are a number of conspiracy theories spreading in the US in 1983 about how, especially in the gay community, about how the US government was basically using HIV as a bioweapon to kill off the gay population in the United States. They didn't specifically say Fort Detrick. They talked about the CIA. They talked about the Centers for Disease Control. But later, of course, the KGB picked this up and they added their own twist, saying it was the Pentagon and it was Fort Detrick. Now, what's interesting is that these conspiracy theorists in the US, many of them picked up on this Cuban propaganda from 1981 and 1982, especially through the Covert Action Information Bulletin. That was one of their sources of information about US biowarfare against Cuba, and it also helped stimulate their thinking to think, okay, well, there's this US bioweapon against Cuba, and now it's being used in the United States against gays and other minorities in the United States. So this brings me to the outline of my presentation. First, I'm going to talk about this Cuban bioweapons propaganda based on Fidel Castro's speech. Secondly, a KGB operation Cockroaches, which built on this Cuban disinformation or Cuban propaganda. Then about Cuban bioweapons propaganda and how that spread into these conspiracy theories in the US about HIV/AIDS, which the KGB then took to use for their HIV as US bioweapon disinformation. An important role of all of this was played by this platform that was financed covertly by the KGB. The Covert Action Information Bulletin was published in the United States. So let's start with Fidel Castro and his speech. In a speech on July 26, 1981, Castro not only cited a press report echoing bioweapons disinformation being spread by the KGB at the time, he also added to the campaign with his own accusations against the U.S. In this speech, he accused the U.S. of attacking Cuban crops, livestock, workers, and even himself with biological and chemical weapons. Many, but not all of his accusations had some basis in fact. He referred indirectly to the various reports from 1975 of the U.S. Senate's Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, popularly known as the Church Committee, named after its chair, U.S. Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The Church Committee had reported on various plans and attempts by the CIA under its Operation Mongoose to assassinate Castro, some involving chemical and biological substances, along with at least one unrealized plan to sabotage Cuba's economy by temporarily incapacitating Cuba's sugarcane workers. So as part of this operations against Cuba under the Kennedy administration in 1961, there was some talk at the National Security Council, maybe we can use some sort of biological weapon to destroy the sugarcane crop in Cuba, but there's no proof that this was ever done or used, and in fact, I don't think it was. However, Castro went beyond the documentation of the Church Committee to accuse the U.S. of responsibility for an epidemic of African swine fever in Cuba in 1971, which basically destroyed 90% of the Cuban pig population. And it was a new strain of dengue fever caused by a new strain of the virus, DNV2. This claim by Castro had received a boost in 1977. They'd been spreading this in 71 with an article in a Long Island newspaper by a particular journalist who was known for spinning various I won't say conspiracy theories, but being very suspicious of the CIA and basically sourcing his reports like on two sources that were unknown. He can't say their names, somebody from the Cuban exile community. One of them was somebody who wanted revenge because he was being prosecuted basically for terrorism under the Carter administration. They decided, well, we want to go back from this thing where we're supporting these exiled Cubans engaging in covert operations on their own in Cuba. We're going to pull the plug on them. They started prosecuting some of them, and then suddenly they turned against the US government and said, well, the US government told me to drop some sort of bioweapon vial inside of Cuba. Then in 1981, there were these accusations regarding a dengue epidemic in Cuba, where 156 people died, including 99 children, and Cuba accused the United States of being responsible for this. Without getting into details, after the Cold War, they actually took the strain of the virus of dengue that was in Cuba, and it basically proved that the strain had come from Vietnam, with which Cuba had close relations at the time, had sent advisors, had this ongoing exchange with the Vietnamese. So it came from Vietnam, naturally, not from the United States. They claimed that the United States had used a strain of the virus that was from 1944-45 that had been spreading in Southeast Asia. Now this brings me to Operation Cockroaches, and it's very interesting. This was basically a disinformation operation by the KGB. It focused especially on a US researcher in Lahore, Pakistan, who was doing research on mosquitoes. He was very interested in preventing the spread of malaria, a well-known US scientist. And they basically said that this laboratory was being used for biological warfare experiments with mosquitoes, carrying the virus into various parts of Pakistan, and later they extended this to include India. What's interesting that Castro in his speech actually cited in 1981 this disinformation, and he mentioned this laboratory in Lahore, and he was saying that it was being used for large-scale experiments on bacteriological contamination. So this sort of shows how the Cubans were picking up on this disinformation from the Soviet bloc and spreading it as well for their own propaganda and disinformation. And here we see the famous or infamous article by Iona Andronov, Incubator of Death, in Literaturnaya Gazeta from 3rd February 1982. After the Cold War, Andronov denied that he was a KGB agent or they had been recruited by the KGB. And actually, I believe him, although he was certainly somebody the KGB sought to promote. They had arranged for his appointment to the US office of Literaturnaya Gazeta. He was known for engaging in propaganda operations, and he said that he was always a good patriot, and this suggests that he basically published what the KGB wanted him to publish because he was a good patriotic Soviet citizen. I don't see any reason not to believe him on that. Now it's interesting because out of this KGB Operation Cockroaches, that's where they basically put out, it was sort of a lone active measure, where they published this article in the Patriot newspaper in India in 1983 with the interesting title, AIDS May Invade India. And this wasn't really the KGB disinformation campaign proper. They came back to this later. It was just sort of like one-off as to, basically it argued that this US laboratory, or not, it's actually not a US laboratory, that this US scientist in Lahore, Pakistan, who was doing the research on the mosquitoes, that they were spreading deadly viruses in Pakistan, and now they were coming across the border, sounds familiar for some of us today, spreading across the border into India. And one of these diseases they were apparently working with was HIV AIDS, and that AIDS might invade India through these mosquitoes biting people inside of India. So this was sort of a one-off operation, but later it became the basis for their Operation Denver, for this big disinformation campaign. Now what's interesting about all this is if you look at the US conspiracy theories about the origins of HIV/AIDS, especially in the gay community, they came back to this issue of the African swine fever virus in Cuba. This accusation from the Covert Action Information Bulletin or also from the Cuban government had been picked up by some normal US newspapers like the Boston Globe. And then this one gay newspaper in New York City, the New York Native, in June 1983, cited a US scientist, Jane Teese, who was saying, well, you know, the symptoms of AIDS are very similar to African swine fever virus, and it might even be the same virus. And guess what? There's basically what they reported in the New York Native is that there was this accusation that the United States government, that the CIA, had brought the African swine fever virus to Cuba. It spread to other Caribbean islands like Haiti, right, where it was one of the largest outbreaks, and then from there to New York City. Now, this was a conspiracy theory. There's no reason to think that the KGB had anything to do with this, and it also reflects the sense of urgency in the gay community because so many people were dying, and the somewhat slow reaction of the Reagan administration to the AIDS epidemic, and they're basically trying to find out what's going on, why isn't there more being done, and they're saying, well, maybe this explains it. This conspiracy theory is basically the US government's not doing anything because they're trying to cover up the fact that it's actually the African swine fever virus and that it's spreading to the US. However, there were others who picked up on this. Charlie Shively, who wrote in the Boston Gay Community News, he basically wrote about the CIA-CDC AIDS political alliance. And he basically argued, and this is yet another conspiracy theory, that it could be that the US government was using HIV/AIDS as a bioweapon intentionally, not to cover up something, they're using it intentionally to kill off gay Americans, right? And this is a way to try to end gay liberation. It's a way to try to destroy the movement. And he was actually in an argument with other sort of homosexuals who were arguing about this. He was basically saying he's against safe sex because that's a way to try to end our identity. And others were saying we need to do safe sex. And this was also an argument within the gay community. He's basically saying, see, you shouldn't listen to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. They're just basically US government agency and they want to get rid of us. And yeah, this explains what's going on. And it's interesting because in 1987 or 1988, after Gorbachev supposedly tried to slow down this AIDS disinformation campaign or curtail it, the Novosti military bulletin in the Soviet Union cited this article from Charlie Shively from 1983. So either the Gay Community News of Boston had a larger base of subscribers than it knew, or they had been basically seeking out this sort of information or these sort of articles in the United States for their own disinformation campaign. 2 minutes, okay. Well, I guess I'll try to speed up then. Also, there was another one for the African-American community. Nathaniel S. Lehrman published in an African-American newspaper, New York Amsterdam News. He basically linked also the CIA to biological warfare, in this case against African-Americans using HIV, but he also cited the Covert Action Information Bulletin and what they had published about US biological warfare against Cuba. And then, of course, there was the Soviet campaign. I won't get so much into that. But this brings us to the question, what is this Covert Action Information Bulletin? It was established in 1978. No, let's see, oops, sorry. Yes, it was established in 1978 at the Havana World Youth Festival. They announced the establishment of this bulletin, which was going to be published in the United States. And basically the person organizing all of this was Phil Agee, whose photo you see here. He was basically a defector from the CIA. He had been very upset about some of the covert operations in Latin America. And he became sort of this famous international figure. He wrote books like On the Run from the CIA. He was known for publishing in books and also in the Covert Action Information Bulletin until it was illegal to do so, publishing the names of alleged CIA officers undercover in US embassies abroad. Now, Agee basically received the KGB code name, Pont, and basically the editorial board, which were probably weren't agents of the KGB, received the code name Rupor. A Cuban defector, though, claimed that the Cuban Active Measures Division, Q13, which was basically funded and run by the KGB, that basically Egi thought he was working for the Cubans. He wanted to work for the Cubans. He didn't want to work for the Soviets. But Egi did know that basically the KGB was funding the Cubans on these things. But still, okay, he's based abroad in Cuba. They're publishing their Covert Action Information Bulletin in the United States, and it's spreading this old Cuban disinformation. And what happens in 1987 is this old propaganda about bioweapons against Cuba was picked up by a US activist, a gay community activist, who was also later very active in ACT UP, Robert Lederer. At the time, he had also been involved in things like the National Liberation Movement for Puerto Rico. I'm not exactly sure how he got involved in that. I tried to contact him, but for some reason he didn't want to talk with me, apparently. But he published articles about HIV/AIDS in 1987, the Covert Action Information Bulletin. He mentioned all of these old arguments from Cuba. He mentioned the stuff from Nathaniel Lehrman that was directed against the African American community, and also things like what Charlie Shively was writing, as well as the thesis of Jaką and Lily Segal, Soviet citizens living in East Germany, also had French citizenship, as they were usually referred to in international publications. Basically, the full-blown thesis about AIDS being developed as a bioweapon at Fort Detrick. So he cites all of these things. I have no reason to believe that he personally was somehow recruited by the KGB or whatever. But what we see here is the importance of the Covert Action Information Bulletin, the fact that such a platform existed, and people who believed in certain theses or things that were close to what the communists wanted to spread, it was very easy for them to publish there, right? And this shows that this bulletin was actually very important for AIDS disinformation. So in conclusion, what can we say about this for today? One of the problems I have, or one of the difficulties I have in researching this disinformation or these disinformation campaigns, is finding out who's actually involved in them, what their relationship is to the security services, Soviet bloc security services, if they have one at all. I mean, you mentioned Carl Sagan. He was a very popular scientist in the United States, had a popular program on public television about science. He was like this well-loved figure, and he picks up on this, nuclear winter thesis, and he believes in it. It's interesting, another popular scientist who was involved in the peace movement, Freeman Dyson, said this is all bunk, which is very interesting. At least he seems to be somewhat more critical of these things. But I think today, if we look at the internet, for example, a lot of times in the United States, the way to attack conspiracy theories, it says, was based on Soviet or Russian disinformation, but actually usually it could be the conspiracy theory started in the United States. The KGB or the Soviets pick up on it, the Russians, they repackage it, help spread it, multiply it, provide platforms for it that it otherwise wouldn't have. And they were doing this already during the Cold War, but now, of course, they have the internet, and they have internet sites, and they have things like Russia Today. So, well, thank you for your attention.
I will try to give a little bit different picture. So not only the state acting as a source of disinformation, because we will have also, or we had, people who had ambitions, and it was very difficult for British intelligence community in the late 60s to discover why they were acting in such a way as they did. On 4th of July 1943, Polish Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief General Władysław Sikorski died in a plane accident in Gibraltar, going back from Middle East to United Kingdom. I will not go into details of this accident. The British Commission called the Court of Inquiry ruled out sabotage, but was unable in 1943 in summer to determine what was the cause of jamming of the controls of plane. So it was and it is a constant source of different conspiracy theory, and of course criticism of findings of this British commission. Also, the Polish government in exile never criticized openly this findings by British in summer 1943. Only in September 1943 there was a short statement in House of Commons about this accident. All documents of Court of Inquiry were released in the early 70s. So we have to remember it when I will be talking about late 60s and Hochhuth and Ewing case. As you see on this picture, Gibraltar as a place of aircraft flying back to United Kingdom and to Middle East was really a very difficult place. There is a strip of land near the border with Spain. Now it is a little bit longer for communication, but in 1943 it was really short. The only survival, and it also gave an oxygen to conspiracy theories, was a Czech pilot Prchal, who survived miraculously from this accident. The death of General Sikorski was, of course, a serious blow for Polish cause in World War II. More than 2 months earlier, the German propaganda had used the discovery of cutting graves in a failed attempt to break alliance between Western powers and the Soviet Union. They failed, but the result was the decision by Soviet Union and using cutting affair to break diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile and openly starting building a communist alternative for the Polish government in exile. But Sikorski's death was used by Goebbels. Here we have some pictures about cutting affair presented in different countries of Europe. Goebbels used the Sikorski death as a tool to continue this cutting propaganda. Here we have not postcard, but which was used by Germans in occupied Poland. So for non-Polish speakers, it says Sikorski, the last victim of cutting, and this German propaganda was working in full steam in occupied Poland, also among Polish forced laborers in Germany. There were leaflets, for example, signed "Czuwaj" in Polish, "Be vigilant." They were distributed in occupied Poland among Polish workers, and there was warning: remember, Paul, that cutting and Sikorski deaths are crimes closely related to each other and committed by the same hand. This hand was, of course, a Bolshevik Jewish conspiracy. It was the constant theme in Nazi German propaganda. And in this case, Goebbels decided that Nazi propaganda should present Churchill as a tool of this Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. So not Churchill personally killed Sikorski, but he allowed the Soviets to kill the Polish leader, and we had different variation of this disinformation, also for a German consumer, because you have here a caricature, a sketch presenting British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden giving the head of Sikorski to NKVD officer, of course, presenting in this anti-Semitic vision, which was well, similar on different pictures in Nazi German propaganda, not only in 1943. But Nazi Germans were quite sophisticated because acting in occupied Poland, of course, they were using newspapers in Polish, which they were publishing, but also using these leaflets, which I talked about, but not openly. Some of these leaflets were signed, for example, Polish Information Service in the country, so they pretended to be a leaflet produced by Polish resistance. But of course, we don't know how. It's impossible to find what was the effect. I presume that not big, and moreover, cutting propaganda, which was of course more effective because it was the killing of thousands of Polish officers. In this case, it didn't work so well for Nazi Germans. And the most important thing was that this disinformation was only aimed at at Polish morale, but there was nothing given to Poles in occupied Poland. So no proposal to collaborate on higher level, no proposal to build a pro-German government or similar body. So nothing, only disinformation. So trying to weaken the morale. In 1943, in summer, it was rather difficult for Germans because this was the turning point of Second World War. So even not being a great specialist in listening to Polish section of BBC, listening to what people were saying, or even reading Polish newspapers in general government produced by Germans, you could clearly see that the war is turning and that Germany is losing the war. What is interesting, and we know it for 20 years, British signal intelligence was able to decipher German diplomatic telegrams containing Goebbels' instructions. They were not able to break the main diplomatic German cipher, but it was a weaker cipher, so they were constantly reading Goebbels or his deputies' instructions sent to different German missions abroad. Not many survived in 1943, and the instruction to how to whisper about Sikorski's death, how to present this idea that he was killed by Churchill and Soviets, and this is the result of this Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. So this was one of the reasons that it was so strongly said in House of Commons in September 1943 by British officials that it wasn't sabotage, the death of Sikorski, without explanation, without any details. So in some respect, the Germans were successful, but of course it didn't change much in the war situation. Practically nothing. What we have more? What is interesting? So this propaganda worked quite good in Egypt, where anti-British sentiments were, it's obvious, very strong, and British diplomats in Egypt in summer 1943 reported to London that in street and also among Egyptian elites there's strong influence, that this propaganda, this German disinformation had some results. But it was a very short period of time, so it died. What is interesting, so there was one man who was very strongly convinced that not he, but Churchill killed General Sikorski. It was, of course, Stalin. he talked with Josip Broz Tito, the leader of communist Yugoslavian resistance, and I think twice repeated to him that you shouldn't fly by British planes. Don't do it because you would end like Sikorski. And in November 1945, so months after the end of the Second World War, Stalin talked to Polish communist leader Władysław Gomułka and said the same. Well, there was rather no reason that Gomułka would be flying by British plane in autumn 1943, but Stalin said that Churchill told him almost that it was the British responsibility to kill, that British were responsible for killing of Sikorski. It's completely rubbish. I don't know why Stalin talked in such a way to Gomułka, whom he, by the way, didn't like, but so he rather contrary should say that yes, go to United Kingdom, visit British. For 20 years after the Second World War, conspiracy theories about Sikorski death were sometimes present in Polish communist in Poland, particularly after '56. But generally, the authors were blaming anti-Sikorski Poles, so reactionaries, Sanacja for General Anders for killing General Sikorski, but it was not. The communist state didn't support this propaganda. So it was rather individual authors who wanted fame. Of course, from the point of view of communist regime, it was nice to hear that Anders and Polish emigre were behind the death of Sikorski. The situation changed in 1967 when almost in the same time David Eyring published his book and Rolf Hochhuth published his play The Soldiers. The title is a little bit longer. Was on theater, or they tried to stage it in the National Theatre in London. Eyring didn't openly accuse Churchill about killing Sikorski, but acting very intelligent in his book, he tried to say that no, probably it wasn't a sabotage. That we need some answers. Hochhuth, who was famous because of his play about Pius XII and all these accusations of Vatican and Pope in case of Holocaust about silence. Now we know that it was a more complex situation than, but this play it went very well with Soviet propaganda in 50s against the Pope Pius XII. In case of Soldaten, the soldiers, Hochhuth used a little bit different narrative than the Nazi Germans. Of course, there was no Jewish Bolsheviks, but Churchill killed Sikorski with the help of officers of special operation executives of a special secret organization which was established in 1940 to help resistance or try to build in some countries resistant movements during the Second World War, disbanded in 1946. And Hochhuth openly said that he knew it from a person who was working in secret intelligence service, so in MI6. It was, well, we know it is a complete lie. It was a complete lie. It was his imagination, not a true story. Even the head of SOE, wartime head, well, his position changed, but let's call him head at the end. Brigadier Colin Gabbins was accused as a tool in this killing, which was completely rubbish because he was a friend of General Sikorski. We can go through his diaries and see how often he was meeting before 43. And we know from many documents, from many memoirs, how close they cooperated. And moreover, officers from Polish section of SOE were, I would not use the term friendly because they acted in British interests, but there was close cooperation between Polish, the 6th Department of General Staff and SOE. But Hochhuth was not completely successful in his lies because he didn't know that, for example, the pilot, Pchal, that he was still alive. So not only Pchal, but a couple of SOE officers brought lawsuits in British courts against Hochhuth till the beginning of 70s, and again against newspapers, generally German newspapers, who were publishing interviews with Hochhuth. So it was not that they were supporting him openly. No. Simply it was news, so obvious that we should print it. And as you can suppose, of course, Hochhuth lost in British courts, not because they were British courts, but because it was untrue. Now we know from documents released in this century, British documents, that let's call it British intelligence community, British officials were secretly supporting with information from closed documents in late 60s, early 70s. So, for example, high-level former SOE Colonel Beachamsweet Escott talked a lot with his colleagues who were still working in British administration in different institutions, and they were given some information. But of course, it was difficult to use it openly in the court of law because you couldn't talk about documents which were classified. But some information were useful in this fighting against Hochhuth disinformation. British Secretary of Cabinet, who was also intelligence coordinator, Sir Bertrand, was coordinating the work of MI5, MI6, Ministry of Defense in collecting information because Prime Minister Harold Wilson was asking the House of Commons about play by Hochhuth and book by Irving. And the British, during this, well, let's call it investigation, said the same, of course secretly, that in 1943, the Court of Inquiry established the causes of the accident, and Hochhuth is simply lying. But why? And there was a problem, because there were some suspicions, particularly by security service MI5, that both guys were acting together, and we have proof, of course, proof, because they are here together as young persons in late 60s. MI5 suspected that particularly Hochhuth play is part of Soviet actions to undermine the Western world, the Western anti-communist propaganda. But there was nothing to say that for sure we were right, that hands of KGB are behind it. Changing a little bit subject, there's one interesting paragraph in memorandum which was sent by Bertrand to Prime Minister Wilson in 1969. Trent, not Wilson, on the picture, because British intelligence knew from CIA about statement by unnamed defector from KGB officer who pointed to NKVD as perpetrators. this unnamed officer said, "It should be recorded that a KGB, it's a note, not his statement. It should be recorded that a KGB defector alleged 2 or 3 years ago that Sikorski was murdered by the NKVD. The defector has not, however, been willing to enlarge on this claim or to produce any supporting evidence. If this information were true, it would mean that the Russians would be operating from a position of strength because they would know exactly what had happened in Gibraltar." And in brackets, "This defector report is extremely delicate and no mention or hint of it should be made publicly." Unfortunately, in released documents, there is nothing more. So there is no original or not a part of this debriefing by CIA, because it wasn't done by British intelligence. It seems, but we are not sure, that it was Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer who defected to Americans in 1961, that he made this statement. And the reaction of my American colleague is a very good explanation why rather we shouldn't believe to Golitsyn. But British intelligence community rather looked in a different way. They looked practically. He didn't give any details. We have a lot of details and information what had happened in 1943 and from talks with officers who remembered 1943 in 67, 68. So nothing could change our view on the causes of death of Sikorski. And honestly speaking, well, without any more information, it's rather difficult to disagree with this conclusion. The British Secret Service's assessment of Hochhuth and Eyring's motives was ambiguous. They saw, it's interesting, in 66, 68, they saw Eyring as a prolific young historian with known fascist leanings and an author who was working with Hochhuth. As I said, MI5 suspected, also without any evidence, that their actions were part of Soviet strategy to undermine Western unity in opposition to communists, and of course to present Great Britain in eyes of Polish and communist country in a bad light. So, concluding, Goebbels' propaganda failed in 1943 in attempt to use disinformation to cause division between the Allies, between Poles and British. However, Goebbels' efforts gave rise to various conspiracy theories which are persisting to this day. But it's unfortunately it's quite popular. Not only conspiracy theories not only among Poles, but people can't live without it. I am afraid. I am afraid. So one sentence finishing. So as we see, the disinformation seems to be an act of government, of secret service, of propaganda machine, but quite often we are finding persons who are going because of his personal interest, because of fame, of money, of popularity, and we heard it in this case of winter, nuclear winter, and also in case of accusation of AIDS, that we had a state actor, but also person who were not paid by anybody in many cases, but had their own agenda, and the same situation is today. So it's not, of course, it is white and black when we are talking about true and untrue, but when we are talking about motives, methods of acting, it's not so simple to explain and to destroy this conspiracy theories. Thank you.